The supply shack at mile 143 stood like a stubborn relic of a time most people had long forgotten. Rusted corrugated metal walls clung to one another, bent from decades of desert storms. A faded wooden sign, barely legible, read Carter's Supplies, its paint peeled and cracked. A rickety generator coughed outside, sparking occasionally as if trying to protest the endless heat of the Arizona sun. To most passers-by, it was nothing more than an abandoned shack, another roadside oddity. But to those who found themselves stranded along that stretch of desert highway, truckers running low on fuel, hikers caught unprepared, Border Patrol agents on long shifts, it was a lifeline. And for Evelyn Carter, it was all she had left. Evelyn had been running the shack for nearly 5 years. She arrived every morning before sunrise, unlocking the rusted padlock and sweeping the dust away from the wooden floorboards. Inside, shelves were lined with water bottles, energy bars, cans of fuel, batteries, and first aid supplies. The smell of metal, oil, and the faint trace of desert dust filled the cramped space. Evelyn never smiled much. She spoke only when necessary. The locals who passed through sometimes called her cold, but that was only because they didn't know what she'd endured. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, its bitterness cutting through the morning chill. The desert was quiet then, except for the low hum of the generator and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. Evelyn liked the silence. It reminded her that out here there were no obligations, no expectations. No one to tell her she was too old, too alone, too broken. On this particular morning, Evelyn noticed a strange shimmer on the horizon, headlights moving too fast, zigzagging in the sand. Her hand hovered briefly near the counter where she kept a small flare gun, a precaution she'd learned over the years. The vehicles vanished behind the dunes, leaving only the scent of dust and gasoline. Evelyn didn't dwell on it. Outsiders came and went. Most were harmless. The town, when she visited it, seemed worlds away. It was a cluster of trailers and a single gas station surrounded by miles of barren desert. People in town sometimes asked why she stayed out at the shack alone, why she didn't sell and move closer to civilization. Evelyn always gave the same answer. Some things are worth protecting, even if no one else notices them. Her backstory was a carefully guarded secret. She didn't talk about the war, about the operations she'd run overseas, about the missions where she had to make decisions that haunted her to this day. She didn't talk about the men she'd seen die in her hands, or the ones she'd left behind when she chose to walk away. Mile 143 was her exile, her penance, her peace. And for a long time it worked. That night, as the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, Evelyn locked the shack with a sense of ritual, turning the key twice, then once more. Listening to the click of the padlock settle, the generator sputtered and died, leaving the shack in near darkness, illuminated only by the silver glow of the moon. She headed to her small trailer behind the shack, her boots crunching on the sand, and crawled into bed. The wind picked up, rattling the metal walls. It was just another quiet night in the desert, or so she thought, because far down the highway, headlights appeared again. Slow this time, deliberate. A cloud of dust followed, carried by a pickup truck filled with men laughing too loud, their voices rough with drink and aggression. Evelyn, asleep but ever alert, heard the low rumble even before the first scream of the engine reached her. This night would change everything. It began as a whisper in the wind, a disturbance in the desert's rhythm. And by sunrise, Evelyn Carter would discover that some people didn't just cross lines. They burned them to the ground. The desert had a way of swallowing sound. By the time Evelyn opened her eyes, the moon had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of early dawn. She stretched, brushing sand from her hair, and headed toward the shack. There was a strange hush in the air, almost unnatural, like the desert itself was holding its breath. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The generator hummed faintly in the background, and the rows of cacti swayed gently in the wind. But then Evelyn stepped closer. The ground near the shack was disturbed, tire tracks cut through the fine desert sand in harsh, uneven arcs. Her heart tightened as she followed them toward the shack, where the first signs of devastation revealed themselves. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, splintered wood jutting out like broken teeth. Shelves lay in chaotic ruin inside, products smashed, cans dented, water bottles shattered, and a layer of fine dust mixed with ash coating everything. A lingering smell of burned fuel and scorched wood filled the air. Evelyn's eyes traveled across the mess, taking in the destruction, her chest tightening. This was no simple robbery. Footprints led inside, deliberately messy, like whoever had done this wanted to leave a mark, a signature of intimidation. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a message. Evelyn's mind raced, cataloging every detail. The smashed shelves, the scorched fuel, the small radio crushed beneath a boot. Whoever had done this knew she would see it all. They wanted her to feel small, vulnerable, helpless, but Evelyn wasn't helpless. Not anymore. She sank to her knees amidst the wreckage, studying the ground carefully. Tire tracks were deep, showing the weight of a heavy vehicle. The tracks stopped in front of the shack, then turned in a wide, deliberate arc, and disappeared over the dune to the east. Whoever these men were, they had planned this. They had chosen her, and they had underestimated her. The sheriff arrived mid-morning, his truck kicking up clouds of dust as he pulled to the side. He was a stocky man with a sunburned face and a permanent squint from years on the desert roads. He stepped out, hands on his hips, surveying the ruins with a shrug. "Looks like vandalism," he said casually, glancing at Evelyn. "You'll need to fill out a report. Nothing we can do until we know who did it." Evelyn's eyes met his, steady, calm. "Someone didn't just vandalize," she said softly. "They came for a reason. You'll see." The sheriff shook his head. "Lady, I've seen this before. Kids, drunks, bored locals. Nothing personal. Best you just clean it up and move on." Evelyn nodded politely, as she always did. But the nod was empty. Inside, a storm was brewing. Once the sheriff left, Evelyn began a meticulous inspection. She noted small details no one else would notice: the scuff marks on the metal counter, the fragments of glass positioned deliberately as if to injure anyone who stepped wrong, the faint imprint of a boot on the remains of a fuel canister. She traced the pattern with her gloved fingers. Every move was intentional, calculated. Her thoughts drifted back to her past, the life she had buried in silence. The missions she'd led overseas. The precision, the strategy, the patience. Every action had consequences. Every target, every shot, every decision measured to the millimeter. She had walked away from it all years ago, choosing obscurity over notoriety. But as she studied the ruins of her shack, that old instinct returned, the one that told her that inaction now would come at a cost far greater than she could bear. The morning heat rose quickly, and the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of scorched wood and crushed sand. Evelyn worked quietly, cataloging the damage. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't even curse. She simply absorbed the scene, letting it etch itself into her memory. Then her gaze fell on a small, shattered piece of metal, a fragment of a license plate left behind. The number etched faintly into the rust gave her a clue. Someone thought they were invisible, untouchable. They were wrong. She returned to her trailer behind the shack, retrieving a locked steel case she hadn't opened in years. Inside lay her rifle, precision tools, and a collection of ammunition that spoke of a past life most people couldn't imagine. She hadn't fired in anger since her discharge, but now, holding the rifle, her fingers brushed over the polished wood, and something primal stirred within her. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't revenge. It was focus. Evelyn spent the rest of the day preparing. She didn't call anyone. She didn't make a scene. She simply moved with purpose, checking her surroundings, studying the horizon, and planning. This wasn't about fear. This was about balance. Some things in the desert were meant to be protected. Some lines, once crossed, demanded a response. As the sun sank behind the distant hills, the shadows grew long. Evelyn stood atop a small rise near her shack, looking out across the desert. The tracks were still faintly visible in the sand, fading slowly in the twilight. She traced them with her gaze, imagining the men responsible, laughing as they destroyed her world. A calm settled over her. The desert was vast, empty, and merciless, just like her training had taught her. And soon she realized it would work in her favor. The first light of dawn would bring more than sun. It would bring clarity. It would bring precision. And it would bring a reckoning. Because some people, when pushed too far, didn't stumble. They waited. They observed. And they never missed. Night fell like a velvet curtain over the desert, swallowing the horizon and leaving only the faint glimmer of stars above. Evelyn Carter didn't sleep. Not yet. She sat inside her trailer, the faint hum of the shack's generator behind her, staring at the steel case she hadn't touched in years. Its metal surface was cold to the touch, almost unfeeling, and yet the weight of what it contained made her hands tremble ever so slightly. Inside lay her past, a carefully wrapped precision rifle, a box of bullets, a set of long-range scopes, and documents she had vowed never to look at again. Medals from missions that were never talked about, commendations from commanders long gone. She ran her fingers over the polished stock of the rifle, feeling the familiar grooves where her hands had always rested. Muscle memory didn't lie. Her hands remembered what her mind tried to forget. She had been a sharpshooter in the army, one of the best. Trained to calculate wind speed, distance, gravity, and heart rate in a single breath. A mission gone wrong had ended her career quietly, leaving her with scars that no one could see. Out here, in the desert, she had thought she could bury the memories. But the men who destroyed her shack had dug them back up. Evelyn stood, moving with the precise, deliberate calm of someone who had been trained to survive. She set up a small area inside her trailer, unpacking the rifle carefully, checking each component. The scope was flawless, the trigger smooth, the barrel clean. She loaded a single round, testing the mechanism slowly, deliberately. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about preparation. She went through every routine she had once known. Breath control, heart monitoring, wind calculation, distance estimation. She walked outside, crouching behind a sand dune, raising the rifle to her shoulder, sighting along the scope at a distant cactus, imagining a target where none existed. Her pulse was steady, her focus absolute. The desert wind whispered around her, carrying the faint scent of scorched wood from the shack. As she practiced, memories flooded her. Nights spent under foreign skies, waiting for a single shot that would change the course of a mission. The weight of responsibility that could crush a person if they weren't careful. Friends lost. Innocence saved. And mistakes that haunted her still, but she was no longer that soldier bound by orders. She was Evelyn Carter, alone in the desert, protecting the life she had built. And now someone had crossed a line. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Evelyn moved quietly back into the shack, examining the wreckage again. She traced the scuff marks, the boot prints, the tire tracks. She remembered the fragment of the license plate she had found earlier. Details mattered. Every trace could be read if one knew how. And she did. She found a notebook in her trailer, old and weathered. She sketched the tire tracks, noting their width, weight, and the angle of entry. She marked potential vantage points around the desert. She mapped the approach routes, thinking like the men who had come to destroy her shack, and like the one who could stop them. Evelyn packed lightly for what she knew would be a confrontation. Water, snacks, a flashlight, and a small survival kit. Her rifle, her instrument of precision, was slung across her back. She checked the bullets twice. One shot, that was all she needed. One shot could end this. The desert night was silent now, almost unnaturally so. She crouched behind her trailer, listening for movement. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked. Somewhere else, a jackrabbit scuttled across the sand. The men responsible had no idea how far they had pushed her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Evelyn allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't bloodlust. It was satisfaction. She was ready. For the first time in years, She felt alive in a way she hadn't since leaving the military. Her thoughts drifted to the men themselves. She imagined them laughing in some abandoned quarry, boasting about the old lady's shack. They were careless, arrogant, predictable, and that made them easy. Easy to find, easy to stop, easy to teach a lesson they would never forget. As dawn approached, she made one last check. The rifle was clean, the ammunition ready, her boots tied tight. Her movements were silent, measured like a shadow. She scanned the horizon, noting every ridge, every rise, every potential path of escape. She didn't need reinforcements. She didn't need luck. She had skill, patience, and a single clear objective, and then the sun began to rise. First as a faint glow, brushing the tips of the distant mountains in pink and gold. Evelyn's breath slowed. Her focus sharpened. Everything in the desert pointed to one truth: the men would return, and they would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. For years, she had buried this part of herself, thinking she had left it behind. But as the desert light spilled over the dunes, she realized that part of her had never left. It had waited, patient, calm, precise, and now it was awake. Evelyn Carter was no longer just a woman running a shack at mile 143. She was a force in the quiet desert, a guardian of what was hers. A single, deadly shot away from proving that crossing her was the gravest mistake anyone could make, and somewhere, just beyond the ridgeline, the men who had laughed at her ignorance would soon learn exactly why some lines should never be crossed. The desert held its breath. And Evelyn waited. The first rays of sunlight streaked across the Arizona desert, painting the jagged peaks in a pale gold. Evelyn Carter moved like a shadow across the dunes, silent, deliberate. The tire tracks she had memorized the night before guided her path, wide, deep, deliberate, leaving a trail that only someone trained like her could read. She followed them through rocky washes, past dead shrubs and twisted cacti, her senses alert to every sound: the distant cry of a hawk, the soft scuffle of a lizard in the sand, the faint hum of a truck engine in the distance. Hours of careful tracking led her to a small rise overlooking a remote quarry. From there, she could see the men who had destroyed her shack. They had chosen a place as reckless as they were arrogant, a desolate pit of rock and sand, far from the highway, far from anyone who could interfere. The quarry was surrounded by jagged cliffs, the walls echoing the sounds of their laughter as they fired bottles with rifles, celebrating their dominance over a woman they thought powerless. Evelyn lay flat on the sand, the heat of the morning sun beginning to press against her shoulders. Her rifle was ready, the scope clean, magnification adjusted precisely for the distance. Her breath slowed, steadying to match the rhythm she had perfected years ago. 1, 2, 3 slow inhales. Her heartbeat aligned with the desert's pulse. She was invisible, untraceable, just a shadow among shadows. She studied the men carefully. There were 5 of them, tall, broad-shouldered, confident. They moved with carelessness, leaving themselves exposed, unaware that someone was watching. Evelyn calculated the trajectory she would need, factoring in the wind gust twisting across the quarry floor, the angle of the sun reflecting off distant rocks, even the heat rising from the desert sand. One shot, one perfectly placed shot, could end this. And she didn't intend to miss, yet she waited. Patience was her ally. She had learned long ago that rushing a shot was a mistake that could cost lives, her own included. The men would continue to reveal themselves, to make their careless movements, and she would strike at the perfect moment. As she observed, Evelyn noted details others would overlook: the men's posture, the way they held their rifles, the shadows cast by their hats, even the direction of their conversation. They were predictable, arrogant, overconfident. That overconfidence would be their undoing. She shifted slightly, keeping her low profile, careful not to disturb the loose sand under her elbows. The rifle's bipod rested solidly on a rock, the scope aligned with the quarry floor. She traced each man's movement. One laughed too loudly, gesturing at a jagged boulder where he thought he was hidden. Another leaned carelessly against a cliff wall, spinning a cigarette between his fingers. These were mistakes, mistakes that Evelyn had been trained to exploit. Hours passed, and the desert heat rose, shimmering over the sand like a mirage. The men began to grow careless, thinking they were safe. Evelyn's patience held. She moved her finger lightly along the trigger, feeling the familiar tension and release as she adjusted her grip. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She was focused. One shot, one consequence, and it would all end. Her mind wandered briefly to the shack she had rebuilt, the meticulous care she had put into every plank and bolt after last night's destruction. That shack was more than wood and nails. It was her independence, her sanctuary. The men hadn't just destroyed property. They had attempted to erase her presence, to humiliate her. That was something she couldn't allow. Finally, she saw the perfect opening. One of the men, the tallest, stepped away from the others, adjusting his aim at a bottle perched on a jagged rock. The sun glinted off the metal of his rifle, highlighting the exact spot where a single well-placed shot would disarm him instantly. Evelyn exhaled slowly, aligning the scope precisely. Distance calculated. Wind speed accounted for. Heart rate steady. Before she fired, she considered the other men. They were out of position, spread apart, their attention entirely on their own reckless game. The calculus was simple. One shot, precisely placed, would neutralize the threat without unnecessary risk, and then she fired. The bullet left the barrel with a barely audible whisper, invisible against the hum of the desert. It struck the man's rifle with perfect precision, causing the weapon to explode in a spray of metal and sparks. He fell immediately, the force of the impact throwing him backward across the sand. The other men froze, their laughter choked off by terror. Chaos erupted as they scrambled for cover, realizing too late that the quiet woman they had mocked was not just capable, she was lethal. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She observed their retreat, noting every movement, every mistake. She didn't chase. She didn't celebrate. She simply disappeared back into the dunes, blending with the landscape she knew like her own body. By the time the distant echoes of shouting faded, she had vanished. The desert reclaimed the scene almost immediately. Dust swirled around the jagged rocks, erasing footprints, scattering debris. The men had no idea who had struck. They had no way to trace her. But one thing was certain. Mile 143 and the surrounding desert had silently witnessed that crossing. Evelyn Carter was a mistake they would never recover from. As Evelyn returned to the shack under the high sun, she didn't glance back. There was no satisfaction in revenge for its own sake. There was only clarity, precision, and the understanding that the desert, like life, was a place where patience and skill dictated survival. She arrived quietly, brushing sand off her boots before entering the shack. The air smelled faintly of smoke and burnt wood, remnants of the previous night's destruction. She surveyed the damage once more, noting repairs she would need to make later. But for now she allowed herself a small, imperceptible smile. The desert had tested her. She had answered. And yet Evelyn knew this was only the beginning. The men who had destroyed her shack had underestimated her, and she would make sure that anyone who dared to cross her again learned the same lesson. Patience, skill, and a single deadly shot were sometimes all it took to restore balance. The desert wind whispered through the dunes, carrying her silent warning. Some people survive by staying invisible until they are forced to remind the world who they really are. By the time the desert sun was fully risen, the quarry was in chaos. The man who had been struck lay motionless, a metallic echo of the precision shot Evelyn had fired earlier. The others scrambled wildly, shouting and cursing, kicking up clouds of sand as they ran for cover behind jagged boulders. Their confidence, so solid only an hour before, had crumbled into fear. What the hell just happened? One shouted, glancing at his fallen companion. His voice trembled as he searched for the invisible threat. "Someone's out here." Another barked, but his bravado faltered as he scanned the ridges and rocks around them. There was no one. Only the desert, silent and unyielding. Evelyn, crouched behind a distant dune, observed every reaction, her heartbeat steady, her breathing calm. She had not fired in anger. She had fired with purpose. One shot, precise, calculated, enough to warn without unnecessary cruelty. The men would live to spread the story, to feel the weight of their mistake, but they would never forget who had struck. She allowed herself a moment to study them. Each movement, each panic-stricken glance revealed weaknesses, exposed mistakes. They had underestimated her, assumed she was nothing more than a fragile woman running a shabby desert shack. That assumption had almost killed them. Evelyn rose slowly, moving with deliberate grace over the dunes, keeping herself low and hidden. Her rifle remained slung across her back, a symbol, a deterrent. The men didn't know she was still observing them. They had no idea the threat had not fully passed. Down below, the men regrouped near the quarry's edge. They argued, pointing fingers and shouting over each other. The desert wind carried their voices toward her, jagged and frantic. It's impossible. One stammered. Nobody could have hit him from there. She's a freak, man, another replied, panic sharpening his tone. We can't just run. We need backup. The absurdity of their arrogance in the face of precision only reinforced Evelyn's resolve. She didn't need backup. She didn't need chaos. She needed patience and the perfect moment. Hours passed, and the men attempted to regain control. They moved cautiously, fear now dictating their every step. One of them approached a makeshift vehicle, checking a rifle, paranoia written on his face. Evelyn calculated their positions, noting that their fear made them slower, predictable. The quarry, once their playground, had become a trap of their own making. She reflected briefly on her life before the shack. Every mission she had ever undertaken demanded focus, demanded calm under pressure, demanded the ability to see things others could not. And now, every lesson, every skill she had ever learned, was serving a new purpose. The desert was her battlefield, and these men, reckless intruders, were the threat. By late morning, Evelyn made her decision. She would not act with anger, but with precision. She didn't want chaos. She wanted clarity. One more demonstration would ensure these men understood who they were dealing with, and that mile 143, her home, was not a place to be trifled with. She moved silently along the edge of a ridge, keeping herself just out of sight. The men, exhausted from panic and adrenaline, had begun to separate, each one thinking they could outmaneuver a threat that didn't exist, except Evelyn's threat did exist. Calculated and deadly, finally, she raised her rifle, adjusting the scope for the distance. One man had leaned over a boulder to examine a makeshift map, unaware that a single, carefully measured shot could neutralize his movement without harm. Evelyn exhaled, her finger gently on the trigger, waiting for the perfect alignment. Time seemed to slow. The desert itself held its breath. Birds in the distance froze mid-flight. The wind softened for a moment, carrying only the faintest whisper across the sand. Evelyn adjusted her aim, calculating wind, distance, elevation, 1,000 tiny details flowing into a single decision, and then she fired. The shot was perfectly placed. It struck the man's weapon, causing it to explode harmlessly in his hands. He screamed, flailing as the shock threw him backward into the sand. The other men froze, their fear now absolute. One glanced around frantically, eyes wide, realizing that the woman they had mocked was not only watching them but controlling the battlefield from a distance. The chaos was immediate. The men scattered, shouting orders to each other, trying to regroup, trying to flee. Evelyn stayed hidden, observing every movement. She did not need to chase them. The desert itself would erase their presence, their arrogance. Their mistakes stopped by the time the last echoes of shouting faded. Evelyn was gone, already moving back toward mile 143. Her presence untraceable, her purpose fulfilled. The men had learned their lesson without her having to kill unnecessarily. One shot had been enough. Precision had replaced violence. Fear had replaced arrogance. Back at the shack, Evelyn surveyed the damage once more. The burnt shelves, the shattered glass, the remains of her old radio, they reminded her why patience, preparation, and precision mattered. She began repairs quietly, methodically. Every plank, every bolt, every shelf was replaced, rebuilt stronger than before. The desert wind blew across the newly fortified shack, Scattering sand but unable to disrupt the order she had restored, word spread quickly in the surrounding area. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about the desert woman with the deadly shot, the one who had struck the smugglers who had dared to destroy her shack. No one knew who she really was. No one knew where she came from. But her reputation began to grow, carried on whispers, carried on fear. Evelyn did not boast. She did not celebrate. She simply continued her work, restoring the shack, restocking supplies, keeping her life quiet and intact. The desert, once a place of solitude, had now become her ally. Every dune, every ridge, every shadow belonged to her. And as the sun climbed higher, the desert heat rising around her, Evelyn understood one thing clearly. Some lines, once crossed, demanded a response. And sometimes a single, well-placed shot was all it took to restore balance. The quarry would remain silent now, a warning to anyone foolish enough to challenge her. And Evelyn Carter, the quiet woman at mile 143, would continue to wait, patient, precise, and deadly, until the next time the desert demanded her attention. By late morning, word had begun to travel. In the small desert towns surrounding mile 143, whispers of what had happened at the quarry spread faster than the wind over the dunes. Truckers who had been passing through that morning told their friends. Border Patrol agents who patrolled the region reported it in hushed, incredulous tones. People who had dismissed Evelyn Carter as just a quiet woman running a shack were suddenly reconsidering everything they thought they knew. "Did you hear what happened out at the quarry?" One trucker asked, leaning against his rig at a small diner 20 miles down the highway. His voice was low, almost reverent. "They said some woman took out a whole crew with one shot." One shot and they were done. The others exchanged nervous glances. No one knew her story. No one knew what kind of life she had led before she moved to mile 143, and now, it didn't matter. The desert had spoken. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained calm. She worked quietly inside the shack, repairing shelves, replacing supplies, and restocking water bottles. Each movement was deliberate, precise, no one watching, no one noticing. She didn't need recognition. She didn't want a medal. She only wanted her sanctuary restored, but the town couldn't ignore it. Within hours, the sheriff arrived again, this time with more seriousness in his step. His previous shrug and dismissive attitude had vanished, replaced by an edge of tension he hadn't felt in years. He parked his truck, stepped out, and approached the shack cautiously. Evelyn looked up from the shelves she was repairing. Her eyes met his. There was no fear there, only calm. He swallowed, realizing for the first time that she was not just any woman. She was something else entirely, Evelyn. "About this morning." He began, hesitating. People are talking." "What happened out at the quarry?" She set down the hammer she had been using and met him steadily. "They crossed a line," she said simply, "and they learned the consequences. That's all you need to know." The sheriff nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The whispers he had been hearing, the truckers' stories, the panic of those men, it all aligned. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Some truths in the desert were better left unspoken. By noon, local gossip had reached full swing. The men who had destroyed Evelyn's shack had returned to town in a panic, hiding out, not daring to speak of what had happened. They were shaken, terrified. Their fear was palpable, carried into the town's bars and cafes, into the small apartments of migrant workers and ranchers alike. No one touched them without a glance over their shoulder. The desert had a new legend, and it traveled fast. Evelyn, however, remained unmoved by all of it. She focused on the shack, restoring order with meticulous care. She checked the roof, reinforced the doors, secured the generator. By the time the afternoon sun began to wane, the shack was stronger than ever. Even the broken sign had been replaced, polished wood gleaming in the desert light, but it wasn't just the physical repairs that mattered. Evelyn was aware of a subtle shift in the desert, in the towns, in the people around her. Respect, caution, and even fear had begun to take root. Some came to her with hesitant smiles, offering extra money for supplies. Truckers left cases of water and jerky on the counter without being asked, as though acknowledging the power of the woman they now feared and admired. The sheriff returned later that day. This time, his demeanor had changed completely. He didn't look at her with suspicion or disbelief or even mild curiosity. He looked at her with quiet respect, almost awe. "Evelyn," he said, "you've done something out here that I've never seen before. Nobody would dare touch your shack again." "That's for sure." Evelyn smiled faintly, but there was no arrogance in it. She only nodded. The desert had given her what it always did: solitude, patience, and now balance. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the desert seemed almost alive with the aftermath of her actions. The quarry was silent. The men who had caused destruction lay low, terrified to show themselves. Truckers passing through gave her a wide berth but left supplies and food on the counter, small tokens of respect. Even wildlife seemed to acknowledge her presence. Moving cautiously around the shack's perimeter, Evelyn walked outside, standing on the small rise behind her shack, and surveyed the land. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of gold and shadow. She remembered the men laughing at her, mocking her solitude, mocking her simplicity. And now, those same men were a cautionary tale, a warning whispered across highways. Desert towns and roadside diners. In that moment, Evelyn allowed herself a deep breath, the kind that fills the lungs and clears the mind. She had not sought fame. She had not sought vengeance. She had acted with precision, with intent, with understanding of the consequences. And the desert had responded. It was quiet now, almost eerily so, and she let the calm settle over her. There was satisfaction in it, yes, but also a deep awareness of what she had done. Some lines, once crossed, demanded action. And in this quiet desert she had restored balance. The legend of Evelyn Carter had begun. It would grow with each retelling, exaggerated or not. Some would speak of her deadly shot, others of her calm and precision, but all would understand one thing: Mile 143 belonged to her. And anyone foolish enough to challenge her would meet consequences as swift, precise, and inescapable as the desert itself. As night fell, she locked the shack, checked the surrounding dunes one last time, and stepped inside. The desert wind whispered around the shack, carrying her warning far beyond what she could see. The quiet woman at Mile 143 had become something more than survival. She had become a force, a reckoning, a shadow that watched patiently, waiting for those who would test it. And deep down, Evelyn knew that this was only the beginning, because the desert had a way of remembering. And so did she. Weeks had passed since the men had dared to destroy her shack. Their initial panic had turned into paranoia, each of them constantly looking over their shoulder, haunted by a presence they could neither see nor understand. Rumors of a woman with deadly skill spread across the desert towns like wildfire. People spoke in hushed voices about the sharpshooter at Mile 143, a ghost in the dunes, a warning to anyone foolish enough to trespass. But for Evelyn Carter, life had returned to its quiet rhythm. The shack was rebuilt, stronger, fortified, nearly impregnable. Every shelf meticulously aligned, every supply accounted for, every bolt tightened. Her workbench gleamed in the morning sun, reflecting the precision and care she had brought to every part of her life. Even so, the solitude she cherished had shifted. She felt the weight of her actions, the responsibility of what she had done. The desert was no longer simply a place of silence. It was now a place of consequence. She had sent a message that would linger long after footprints faded and voices quieted. One afternoon, as she checked her water supplies, a figure appeared on the horizon. The sheriff, cautious as ever, walked toward the shack, his boots crunching on the sand. His expression was serious, and there was a hint of curiosity, tinged with respect. "Evelyn," he began, pausing as he approached, We've looked into the quarry incident. Those men, they're terrified. No one's seen them since. People are calling it a miracle, that one shot. They say..." He trailed off, unsure how to phrase the truth. "They say I'm dangerous?" Evelyn asked softly, her eyes calm, almost unreadable. The sheriff hesitated. "More than dangerous, precise, unstoppable even. No one wants to cross you." Evelyn nodded. It wasn't a matter of pride. It was a fact. She had acted as the desert demanded, with precision and patience. That was enough, but the sheriff's next words startled her. I also found out about your past. Military records, sharpshooter qualifications, classified missions overseas. You weren't just a local business owner. You were something else entirely. Evelyn let a faint smile touch her lips. It had been years since she'd had to acknowledge that part of her life, the part that had shaped every skill she now relied on. I'm still that person, she said quietly. Just retired. The sheriff's gaze softened. No wonder the men didn't stand a chance. Nobody would, but I think you need to understand something. What you did out there, it's going to follow you. People will tell stories, exaggerate. You may not want it, but it's already started. You're a legend now, Evelyn, whether you like it or not. Evelyn looked out across the desert, feeling the wind on her face. She didn't fear her legend. She understood it. Respect, caution, and fear were tools in the desert as vital as water. She had given the men a lesson they would never forget, and she had preserved her sanctuary. That was all that mattered. As the sun began to lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red, Evelyn decided to visit the quarry one last time. She wanted to see it for herself, to measure the consequences of her actions. The desert was silent, almost eerily so, as she approached the rocky pit. The remains of the men's scattered belongings were still there, empty water bottles, abandoned rifles, and torn clothing, all testaments to their frantic flight. The tracks had long since been erased by wind, leaving only sand and stone to bear witness. She knelt briefly, touching the sand where the first shot had landed. It was a moment of reflection, not of triumph. Every life she touched, every action she took, carried weight. She had spared them from further harm, but she had ensured they would never forget her. That was the balance she had sought. Her thoughts drifted further, to the missions she had left behind. The friends she had lost, the orders she had followed, the lives she had saved, and the ones she hadn't. Evelyn realized that the desert had become a mirror of her own life. Harsh, silent, unforgiving, but precise. It demanded accountability. It demanded respect. And it demanded clarity. By the time she returned to mile 143, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The shack glowed softly under the warm light of the lanterns she kept outside, a beacon of resilience and quiet authority. Inside, she cataloged her supplies, made notes, and prepared for the coming days. The desert, as always, was patient. So was she. That night, Evelyn allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the men who had destroyed her shack, the fear she had instilled, the reputation she now carried, the quiet but undeniable power she had wielded. And she realized that power came not from anger or revenge, but from calm, precise action, guided by skill and patience. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. A hawk circled above. The desert was alive, and Evelyn knew she was part of it now, as much as it was part of her. She had carved a place for herself in its harsh landscape, earned respect, and ensured her sanctuary would never again be violated. But even as she prepared for sleep, she knew the desert held its own lessons. Someone else, someday, might cross a line. And Evelyn Carter, the quiet woman who had become a legend, would be ready, patient, precise, and unstoppable. In the quiet of her trailer, she allowed herself a small, contented smile. She had faced the consequences of others' arrogance. She had acted with justice, not cruelty. And she had preserved her life, her shack, and her peace. The desert, vast and unforgiving, whispered in approval. It had tested her. She had answered. And in the shadows beyond mile 143, everyone who had doubted her would remember that a single, well-placed shot was enough to change everything. The desert at mile 143 was quiet, as it had always been, but now it held a new sense of balance. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of her rebuilt shack, brushing dust from her boots, scanning the horizon. The sun rose slowly, spilling gold across the dunes, illuminating the hard-won sanctuary she had protected. Every plank, every shelf, every container of supplies spoke not only of survival, but of determination, resilience, and unyielding vigilance. The men who had destroyed her shack were gone from the desert, scattered into towns far beyond her reach. Their reputations shattered, their fear permanent. The desert had claimed its victory through her precision and patience. The whispers that had spread across the region had grown into stories, some exaggerated, some awe-filled, all tinged with fear. Evelyn did not care for legend. She cared for peace. Inside the shack, everything was in order. Water bottles lined up neatly, fuel cans stacked carefully. A small ledger documenting supplies for travelers ready for inspection. She ran her fingers over the wood of the counter, polished from careful use. The shack was her home, her refuge, and now it was unbroken. She allowed herself a deep breath, savoring the quiet that had returned, yet peace, Evelyn knew, was a fragile thing in the desert. The wind could shift, storms could rise without warning, and people could act recklessly. Vigilance, she reminded herself, was not an option, it was a necessity. But for the first time in months, she allowed herself a sense of completion. She had met the challenge, exacted precision, and restored balance without losing herself to anger or chaos. As she stepped outside, a distant hum caught her attention. A truck was approaching, its tires crunching over the sand. She tensed for a moment, instinctively reaching for the rifle she had carried for weeks. But she relaxed when she saw the familiar shape of a local trucker waving from the cab. "You're open for business again." "I see," he called, smiling. "Heard about what happened out at the quarry, and figured you could use some fresh supplies?" Evelyn gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied quietly, accepting the crates of water and rations. No one had to know that the gesture was more than generosity. It was acknowledgement, respect, a silent way of saying, "We believe in you." The trucker left after exchanging a few words, leaving Evelyn alone once more. The desert wind picked up, carrying grains of sand across the landscape, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a companion, a witness to her patience, precision, and resolve. She surveyed the horizon. The dunes stretched endlessly, empty and silent, yet full of possibility. Travelers would pass through again. Stragglers and wanderers would need water, shelter, and guidance. And mile 143 would be there for them, steadfast and secure, later, as evening fell. Evelyn prepared a small dinner inside her trailer. She worked slowly, intentionally, savoring the routine. Life had once been chaos, missions overseas, fleeting trust, and dangers around every corner. Here, every task was simple, tangible, and meaningful. The peace she had carved out for herself was more valuable than any accolade, medal, or recognition. After dinner, she stepped outside once more. The sky had turned a deep, purpling blue, dotted with stars. She leaned against the railing she had built along the shack's perimeter, the desert stretching endlessly before her. In the distance, a coyote barked, and a hawk circled silently in the night air. The world was alive, but calm, balanced. Evelyn allowed herself a thought she hadn't permitted in years. Satisfaction. Not pride, not arrogance. Satisfaction. She had defended her home, upheld her principles, and maintained the sanctity of her solitude. The desert had tested her, and she had passed. She reflected briefly on her past life, the missions she had left behind, the people she had lost, the decisions she had made. The desert had reminded her that skill, patience, and precision could bring justice without unnecessary destruction. It had also reminded her that peace was earned, not given, and that vigilance could coexist with serenity. The desert held secrets as it always had. It demanded respect. It rewarded patience. And it observed those who dared to live within it, silent and unwavering. Evelyn understood this deeply. She had learned in the harshest ways that crossing her was not merely foolish, it was fatal. And she had acted accordingly. As night deepened, she checked the shack one last time. Every window latched, every door reinforced, every supply accounted for. The shack was ready for any traveler, any challenge, any test the desert might present. It was more than survival. It was mastery. Evelyn stepped to the rise behind the shack and looked out across the dunes, letting her eyes sweep the horizon. The desert, harsh and unyielding, stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt threatening. It was hers, not owned but understood. She had adapted. She had endured. She had emerged precise, patient, and unstoppable. And somewhere in the distance, the men who had dared to destroy her shack would remember. They would whisper, tell their stories, and carry fear as long as they lived. But Evelyn didn't need them. She didn't need recognition. The desert, the shack, and her own meticulous planning had been enough, finally. As the night settled fully, Evelyn allowed herself a small, rare smile. The stars glittered above her like distant witnesses, silent and eternal. She felt the rhythm of the desert beneath her feet, steady, patient, alive. Her sanctuary was safe, her reputation intact, her life reclaimed. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across the dunes, as if carrying a message only she could hear. You are ready. You are capable. You belong here. Evelyn Carter turned back toward her shack, feeling the weight of peace and the clarity of purpose. Mile 143 would remain her home. Travelers would come and go, but none would dare threaten her. And in the vast silence of the desert, one truth would endure: some women are quiet, precise, and unstoppable, and Evelyn Carter had proven that a single, well-placed shot could change everything. She closed the door behind her, the latch clicking into place with a sense of finality. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, a living testament to patience, precision, and survival. Inside, the shack glowed warmly, a sanctuary restored. And Evelyn Carter, the woman who had weathered the storm, rebuilt her life, and asserted her power with calm and deadly skill, finally allowed herself to rest. The desert was at peace. So was she.